right, well, let's get started. I want to welcome everybody. I'm Neil Chase. I'm the CEO here at CalMatters. And with me is Rachel Becker, who covers the environment and specifically water issues for us. And we are here to talk about water in California, which is that wonderfully important topic that we all take for granted probably too often. And need to spend some time really learning about and understanding its effect on us and our lives. And so Rachel's going to help us do that today. We're doing this as part of a project with the California State Library. They have enabled us to do this journalism and present it in many different formats to people in libraries and schools across the state. A lot of the material we're talking about is on a website, calmatters.org/forlearning, where you can get all the resources and learn more about the work that we're talking about today, as well as some other topics. There's lesson plans and worksheets and curriculum there on a handful of topics that we've covered, including the recent election, and there'll be a lot more this year leading up to some pretty extensive coverage of the election coming up this fall, which is a big one for California. But now we'll turn specifically to water. And Rachel Becker. Rachel, welcome. I wonder if I can get you to just take a minute telling us about your fascinating and more academic than most journalists background.
Yeah, I came through the funnel of science to journalism. I worked in a lab for a while, studying the connection between the brain and the immune system, and realized that I love science and I love how it can inform our knowledge of the world, but I didn't love to do the science. And so fortunately, I found my way to journalism where I could write about science and the way science intersects with all sorts of fascinating topics, whether it's policy or politics, the environment. And now after covering climate and air for CalMatters for a couple of years, I've gotten to focus entirely on water quantity, quality, access, affordability, how it flows through the environment, affects ecosystems and wildlife. It's pretty much the best beat I could imagine.
Well, you're the best person I can imagine to do this because you've got this scientific inquiry background on top of the journalism skills, and it takes, I think, that level of understanding to be able to do the research and do the work, and then it takes a different set of skills to actually translate all that back to English, right? And put it in forms that we can understand and in text and in video and on the radio, and you do a great job of it. So I appreciate you taking a little time out from that to have this conversation today.
Always happy to talk about water.
Yeah, and we don't talk enough about water. It's obvious, it's in our lives every day. I think we take it for granted way too often. But aside from it falls from the sky, which I think many of us know, talk a little bit about where California actually gets its water. Though when I turn on the tap in my house in California, where's that water coming from?
Depends where you're at. So that water could be coming from Northern California, from rivers that flow, off the Cascades, up the Sierras, and to reservoirs and funneled south through state and federal water projects, this kind of vast network of pumps and aqueducts and canals. It could come from beneath your feet. It could be groundwater that's pumped through wells and cleaned up and sent through the pipes. It could be, in some places, it could be desalinated ocean water. It really varies. It could be desalinated groundwater in inland parts of California. So there's a huge variety of where folks get their water.
So I'm going to make you go back to one thing you just talked about, which is fascinating, the desalinated water, right? This is taking water out of the oceans basically and getting the salt out of it and making it drinkable and usable for showers and things. How widely has that been used, and does it really work?
It's picking up. The largest desalination plant in the Western Hemisphere is in Carlsbad, California. And there are a few more that have been recently approved for ocean desalination, one in the Dana Point area, and one has been approved in the Monterey Peninsula. Those haven't been constructed yet, though, but they are, and especially the Monterey Peninsula one has a number of regulatory hurdles to clear first, but they've cleared some preliminary hurdles at least.
I mean, if we can start tapping into the ocean water, then we sort of have an unlimited source forever, right?
In in theory, there are kind of a number of constraints, including the energy use. They're pretty energy intensive to push all that seawater through the filtration membranes. Um, there's also um, some environmental concerns in terms of the effects of returning that concentrated brine to the ocean, and also some concerns around the intakes, although some of the newer plants that have been received some preliminary approvals are trying to get around that through changing the location of the intakes from above the surface to below the seafloor.
Wow, wow. So we always talk in California about drought. We also always seem to be cleaning up from floods and mudslides and things. We can't seem to get it right. We can't seem to have a normal quiet time between drought and flooding. Where are we now? We've had a ton of rain in a lot of parts of the state. Does that mean we're okay for a while? We don't need to worry about water for the next few years?
Yeah, that's kind of always the point that California is in, right? There's that Steinbeck quote of what during the dry years, the people forgot about the rich years, and when the wet years returned, they lost all memory of the dry years. And I think that California is kind of always, swinging from one way to the other, and that's really kind of the picture of our climate is these kind of increasingly extreme swings between wet and dry, and the kind of the projection is that as temperatures increase, we'll be seeing more dry punctuated by extreme wet, and so uh, there are a number of projects that are sort of in the works that are attempting to kind of better wrangle the increase in flooding, and store that water. But there are also a number of concerns about if floodwaters are diverted into storage and for use, what the effects that will have on the ecosystem.
A lot to manage, right? Um, Talk a little bit about groundwater because we hear about water being in the ground. You can pump it out, and some people in California live on wells, right, and pump the water out of the ground for themselves. Other entire communities are without water or have very little water supplies because of the damage to that underground storage.
Yeah, groundwater is pretty incredible. It's a huge kind of under-recognized source of water in California. 80% of Californians depend on groundwater for some portion of their water supply. And of California's total water supply, it makes up about 40% in, an average year, up to 60% in a dry year. And so it's really kind of vitally important. It's kind of considered, in many parts of California, it's considered sort of a savings account, that water that's always there, but it takes time to build up, and is difficult to recharge once you've overtapped it. And in parts of the San Joaquin Valley during the last two droughts, really vast areas saw groundwater wells go dry, as especially as agricultural users were sort of cut off from surface water that was drying up during the drought. And so they turned to groundwater to irrigate their crops. And as a result, all of that strain on the groundwater stores led to more dry wells. And we saw it in the most recent drought, really kind of spreading to even places that are considered much wetter, like the Sacramento Valley saw a spate of dry wells, especially in Glenn County.
I guess it's hard to picture groundwater, right? You imagine, you dig up your backyard and there's a giant tank down there holding water, but this is water that's mixed into layers of sand and dirt, and it's moisture in the earth, right? It's not like giant pools of water you can swim in down there.
Yeah, it's in aquifers, and it's kind of the interstitial water between um, soil and layers of earth. And you're as you kind of get deeper and deeper and deeper, you're gonna get older water. And what's interesting is that at the different levels, you often have kind of different issues. You could have at a shallower level, you might have more nitrates issues. When you go deeper, you might have more issues with things like arsenic, depending on your location. So yeah, groundwater is
Arsenic sounds bad. That sounds like a bad thing to have in your water.
it's not it's not good for you. That's for
Yeah,
certain.
yeah. What about the usage? I think people who are in cities tend to at least have the idea that most of our water goes to agriculture. I don't know if people on farms would say that necessarily. I mean, how much does agriculture, which of course is the most important industry and feeds so much of America, so much of North America, how much of the water is used by agriculture?
Yeah, so this is based on data from the Public Policy Institute of California, and they estimate that communities use about 10% of California's water, agriculture uses about 40%, and the environment uses about 50%. Um, when you kind of break that down and you look at the amount that humans use, uh, agriculture is about 80%. But California's agriculture is also the most productive in the country. It's a really vital industry that feeds people, all over the nation and beyond.
Yeah. Go back to the part about the environment. So roughly half the water is used by the environment, meaning trees and plants and lakes take it you don't think about that, right? All the water that falls, a lot of it, the earth gets first shot at the water before we get it, right? A tree can soak up that water before we can like get it into a pump or something and get it into a water system. So that's a different, a fascinating way to look at it. And then you're talking about half of it being used by the environment, 40% going to agriculture. So 10% of the water that is available in California, is for people who are for home use, right? And what does that mean for when there's a drought and we say, okay, people need to cut down their usage, to shower less, shower with a friend, as the old bumper stickers used to say. Um, Water your lawns less than things. Can you really make a difference if people in their homes conserve water if it's only 10% of the water used in the state?
That is the hope, is that every drop that's saved during a dry period or wet period is then, tucked away and used is able to be used later or be able to used in other places that may also need it. It's a finite resource.
Yeah.
The During the last drought, Governor Newsom called for Californians to save about 15% more water, but the conservation wasn't mandated, and California fell pretty far short of that request. And now California is working on developing urban water conservation regulations, and they're very complicated and very specific for communities across the state. Each urban water supplier is going to have to kind of calculate and then live within a budget that's based on a number of factors, including internal water use, um, inside homes, for instance, landscape water use at certain businesses that have dedicated outdoor meters. And then there are a number of variances that are going to be calculated too. Like there's a llama variance. Like if you have livestock, things like that, that'll also be factored in, along with like climate and temperature. So um, these are currently in the works. They've been sort of uh, many of the urban water suppliers said they would be too costly and difficult to meet. And so since then they've been relaxed. And now there's a lot of concern from environmental groups that they are now going to be too relaxed to lead to the conservation that is hoped for. So those are still in progress.
Yeah, it's tough to balance those interests, right? Of the different, everybody needs water for different things. And so you're saying we should all get livestock in our yards, and that way we would qualify for more water?
I'm not advocating for more llamas, Neil.
I think livestock's actually illegal in some cities. People are fighting to be able to get raised chickens in their yards, right? Um, let's talk a little bit about what else we can do to save water, aside from not using it. There's new ways to try to capture it. You see people with rain barrels trying to capture water, that sort of thing, but also recycling, right? Trying to get used water back into the system and make it usable with the perhaps unfortunate moniker being toilet to tap, which doesn't sound terribly attractive. But talk about the efforts to keep water from leaving the state once we have it.
Yeah, and toilet to tap, that's sort of the decades old moniker has really stuck, but it's actually a lot more complicated. There are kind of two forms of I'm going to say toilet to tap because now it's on the tip of my tongue. But there are two
I
parts
think we want that to be, I think we want toilet to tap to be more complicated than just that. So that's
yeah,
good.
exactly. Of potable reuse. There's kind of the indirect method where the water is, highly treated and then ends up in a reservoir or in groundwater where it sort of mixes in with the other water. You get sort of a buffer period, and then it gets kind of treated like with the rest of the water and goes through the pipes into taps. And then there's direct potable reuse, which is much newer. The state only recently, in the last year, came up with regulations and rules to oversee direct potable reuse. And basically, this is where the water is highly, highly treated, then goes through normal drinking water treatment and goes straight to pipes and taps. And that, bypassing the buffer of groundwater or reservoir. But again, this is very highly treated. It gets sort of bubbled with ozone. It gets chewed up by bacteria. It gets filtered through activated carbon. It goes through reverse osmosis membranes several times. That's the same technology that's used in desalination often. It gets cleansed with a oxidizer, beamed with UV light, and then
Wow.
it's too clean at that point, and so minerals actually have to be added back into it, and then it goes through regular drinking water treatment.
Wow.
And at which point it might actually get, a little less purified because it's being, going through the
It
same
gets,
pipes
it
that all
gets
the other
eventually gets
water is.
mixed in with all the other water, right?
Mm.
And how widely are those programs? Is there any place where that's being used extensively right now?
There's a big plant that's getting built in Southern California, but these rules are so new that it's going to be a little while before we see this being a really big part of California's water supply. It's probably going to be largely in places too where water is pretty scarce because this isn't going to be cheap water.
Yeah, yeah. Let's talk about a different situation. 1 out of 75 houses in California doesn't have clean drinking water, right? And there's lots of different reasons for that, but I think a lot of people who are in an urban environment where every house has plenty of water coming through the tap don't think about this. There's other people in rural areas who've been having to get bottled water delivered to them for a long time. Is anything material being done to fix that problem? We hear a lot of talk about it, and are there efforts to do something about that? Is it even fixable at this point?
Ooh.
Or is
Uh,
that something you're familiar with?
It's uh, it's definitely a complicated issue. Kind of vast swaths of the Central Valley, for instance, have issues with nitrates. And there are folks are on bottled water, and there are fill stations for where people can go get water. But it's a pretty difficult issue and pretty pervasive. You know, places. There are new regulations that are expected from the EPA soon too that would place limits on forever chemicals. So the people might know them as PFAS chemicals. These are the things that were used to make Teflon and Gore-Tex back in the day, and that are called forever chemicals because they don't break. They really resist breaking down in the environment. They've been linked to health issues, including certain cancers. And they are truly ubiquitous, especially in places near hotspots, including landfills, airports, because they've been used in the past in firefighting foams, near military bases. And so the EPA is actually expected to, the US EPA is expected to really, really tighten down on how much is going to be allowed in drinking water by like orders of magnitude compared to their previous guidelines, which weren't even enforceable limits. And so this is going to definitely put a strain on water suppliers around the state that are now going to have to install treatment when they may not have been required to before under state guidelines.
Mm.
So it's definitely, it seems as if water suppliers are going to, many may struggle with the cost of complying with these regulations.
Wow. There's a question in the chat about bottled water. Obviously, we see a lot of bottled water. We see people buying it and in large quantities at stores and things, does it have any material impact? Does the bottling of water take water out of our water supply from California, or does people using bottled water save water from the tap? Or is there any impact like that we know of?
There are, I've not covered the fights over the bottling in California, although there is some great coverage out there. The bottled water, unfortunately, does wind up playing some role, especially in parts of California where household wells have gone dry or where the water is not clean to drink. Many folks are still on tanks, storage tanks, and trucked water where their wells have gone dry, and especially in the San Joaquin Valley. And so that does play a larger role than you would hope to see in California.
Yeah, yeah. You've talked a little bit about what some of the regulations coming. What else is being done, or what are people saying should be done? What things could we be doing to ease the water, especially the periodic drought, and then worrying about it, then not worrying about it, and going through all the cycles, and the people who don't have water. Is there a lot of energy around the legislature and around the governor for doing things? Is this a high priority for people? Is it ignored? Like how much attention is being paid and how much should be paid?
Um, there's there is still some energy, although I definitely notice that the energy increases during times of drought. Um, and we are out of drought for now. So, but there was quite a lot of movement during the drought around water rights and kind of the state's priority system for surface water coming off of rivers and streams, for instance, that occurred during the last drought and kind of tightening up that system. It remains to be seen if that'll get picked up again now.
Mm.
There's also quite a lot of there has been a decades-long push to create a tunnel to tunnel water through the delta. Um, this delta tunnel project, it's been known as the peripheral canal. It's in the, I think it was the 60s. This idea has been around forever, and the idea is that it would kind of bypass the delta where much of the water for the state and federal water projects flows from northern to southern California. Um, and there has been quite a push under Governor Newsom to see this tunnel through. It's a very controversial project. And the state's own environmental documents have acknowledged that there could be harm to wildlife and fish species in the delta. And delta communities are also very concerned about what the construction of this tunnel will do to their region when, in fact, they won't see, any change in their water supply from it. The goal is to allow the Department of Water Resources to pipe, additional water south to reservoirs and farms and cities, especially beneficial for during storms, is what state officials say. When endangered species protections and other restrictions might otherwise limit pumping. But yeah,
It's a
very,
lot. It's a
very controversial.
ongoing, seems to come and go, right? A lot of controversy about it, and then it dies down again. One last thing, let's talk about keeping an eye. I know you spend a lot of time just looking at the situation, right? What's in the reservoirs? Are we in drought? Are we not in drought? We have this water tracker, and we'll share the link here to it. Talk a little bit about the water tracker, just especially what kinds of things do people follow to figure out how we're doing with water and what the situation is.
Yeah, I have to give so many kudos to the data team, John and Jeremiah and Erica, for this really spectacular water tracker that they've built. It's so clear and easy to follow. It includes information like reservoir levels. The state snowpack is a pretty great indicator of what we can expect, at least for the summer ahead. It's kind of California's oldest reservoir that holds onto water for the dry months. Uh, problem is under climate change, as things get warmer, the snowpack is gonna suffer as a result. And so that's kind of one of the things California is having to think about going into the future, is how to navigate without that vital reservoir. Um, uh, and it also, the drought tracker answers questions that I know that I get a lot, which is, are we still in drought? So it includes kind of information about historic droughts and current drought conditions, reservoir levels, what else? Snowpack, and we already talked about that.
Yeah.
But it's pretty precipitation, which is always interesting to me, and where we're at annually too compared to previous years.
No, great. I know,
And
obviously,
much more.
yeah, that drought tracker gets a lot more attention when we're in times of drought, but I know there are people like you who are keeping an eye on it all the time. It's a nice resource to have no matter where we are. Rachel, I thank you for taking the time to do this and for digging into these water issues, so deeply on behalf of all of us who need the water every day and need to understand more about what's happening with it. So I thank you for doing this and taking the time. I want to thank the California State Library for making this possible and making all the educational materials available, the curriculum, the worksheets and things like that, all of which are on the website I mentioned before, calmatters.org/forlearning. And we look forward to you using those materials and letting us know how they work for you and what we can do to make them better. And we'll be back every month with different topics to talk about. Thanks everybody for coming.